welcome everyone. This is the third edition of Corpus Linguistics and Applied Linguistics Research 2023. Before anything else, I'd like to say thanks to the Universidad de Murcia, Universidad de Murcia, and the School of Humanities, and also my own research group that are making this activity possible. This is the third edition of Corpus Linguistics and Applied Linguistics Research. We started this thing in 2021. Back then, it was just, just shortly after COVID-19. It felt okay to do online talks. It was still popular. 2022, we were feeling people are fed up with online talks. It turned out people were not fed up with online talks, especially corpus linguistics talks. And this was a hugely popular edition. And I have the honor today to introduce the 2023 edition of Corpus Linguistics and Applied Linguistics Research series of talks. We have an amazing lineup for this edition. Coming up next week, we have Dr. Jesse Egbert. Then we will have Dr. Isabella Clark, Magali Paquot. But today we have Dr. Niall Curry. I know that some of the questions that come up later is whether these talks will be made available. You can find these talks online on the YouTube channel, and they are, thanks to the generosity of the speakers, they can be found online. Today we have Dr. Niall Curry, Manchester Metropolitan University, senior lecturer, and he will be talking about contrastive approaches in corpus linguistics research. I promised that I'd be short when talking about Niall's CV, and that is very difficult to do, to be honest. So Niall is the perfect combination of a young scholar, but somebody who has made so many contributions in probably 5, 6, 7 years. So I can only thank Niall for being here today and to share his research with us. As I said, Niall is a senior lecturer in TESOL and Applied Linguistics in the Department of Languages, Information and Communications at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. I think he has a wide spectrum of interest, ranging from discourse analysis to applied linguistics in terms of the exploitation of corpora and corpus linguistics research methods across a variety of scenarios and topics. I invite everyone to check out his website and check out his. I lost track of how much and how good these publications, Niall. So you will excuse me if you will spare me if I just don't mention just the latest. It is just extraordinary, the range of publications that we can find in Niall's CV. As I said, we will keep it short. I will keep it short. Niall will share some of his insights into this topic today. Around 50 minutes, and then we will have the opportunity to have a conversation around some of the questions, Q&A that the people that are today with us in the chat. Feel free to throw your questions in the chat, and I will take these questions to Niall at the end of the session. So thank you everyone that has joined us today. And of course, thank you, Niall. I will stop sharing my presentation. Okay, thank you so much. Over to you, Niall.
Thank you so much, Pasquale, and thank you for having me here to speak a little bit about some of my research and for that very kind and generous introduction. It was very, very nice. So I'm happy enough to get started. And the title for the talk that I'm presenting today is Contrastive Approaches in Corpus Linguistics Research. And largely what I wanted to do with this presentation, if you can see the screen okay, you can see the screen all right for my presentation? Super. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to give a little bit of background in maybe some of the key considerations that we might consider in corpus-based contrastive and translation studies. And then what I prepared are a couple of little case studies reflecting on some previous work that I've done with a number of different people in the field, including Pasquale and our work on the COVID-19 discourses, in order to be able to think a little bit about notions of comparability and maybe some of these core ideas that are fundamental to contrastive linguistics, but that I think can also help us in the way that we undertake corpus linguistic research, whether or not what we do is multilingual. And I'll try and maybe kind of reflect a little bit on that towards the end. So when I talk about these key considerations in corpus-based contrastive linguistics, what am I thinking about? Largely, I'm thinking about these notions of the types of data that we use, so the multilingual corpora in multilingual contrastive research, and then two particularly important key theoretical foundations, the tertium comparationis and equivalence, and then maybe I'll reflect a little bit towards the end about some of the challenges that we face in undertaking this kind of research. So when I'm talking about contrastive linguistics, what I generally am talking about is multilingual contrastive studies. However, we could think about contrastive linguistics more broadly to think about comparing similar varieties of an individual language across varieties, or even the same variety across time, for example. So contrastive linguistics doesn't necessarily need to be inherently multilingual, but often contrastive linguistics is. And in the context of corpus linguistics, we think about this in relation to two particular types of corpora. These could be parallel corpora, often referred to as translation corpora, or comparable corpora. And in the context of parallel corpora, typically what we're talking about is source texts and translations of those source texts. While with comparable corpora, we're dealing with something that's a bit trickier to define, or we're talking about multiple monolingual corpora that are developed using a very similar sampling frame or the same sampling frame, where certain kind of criteria are aligned at each stratum of the corpus construction. And I'll say a little bit more about how we maybe determine that using this notion of tertium comparationis in a moment. So for example, you could think of the Kiap corpus developed by Kirsty Flotte et al. In Bergen, which is a corpus of academic writing in English, French, and Norwegian in economics, linguistics, and medicine disciplines. Or in the context of some previous work that I conducted with Pasquale, the Convidas corpus, which is a corpus of COVID-19 from the Conversation UK and Spain, designed to be comparable in that regard. So collected and used and developed in the same way for a comparable corpus. The kind of ideas I think that underpin this largely relate to the tertium comparationis and equivalence. And in this regard, the tertium comparationis can quite simply understood, although maybe not quite a simple concept. I think in simple terms, it can be understood as a comparable common ground. So some assumed common ground. And in one of the case studies that I'll talk you through shortly, one of the assumed common grounds that I worked with was the assumption that research article texts in multiple languages will contain questions that are used in order to be able to perform some kind of interactive function. So that was an assumption, and the idea then is that we test that assumption, and we test that assumption with equivalence. So equivalence can really take any form. We might be testing it in terms of frequency. So are they similarly frequent in different languages? Maybe thinking about where they occur in text. Do they occur at similar places? We may be thinking about whether or not they have the same functional use. We may be wondering if they have the same formal presentation. And this list can really be extended on and on and on. And the idea is that as we develop our assumption, we test our assumption, we refine our assumption, and we continue to kind of reinterrogate our assumed comparisons. With this, the idea theoretically would mean that we would never actually finish doing anything. We would just continuously interrogate until, I guess, we retire and don't publish anything or write anything up. So eventually you have to make a decision that, okay, I'm going to stop here. This is enough information for me to work with, and then potentially reinterrogate that later. So we can think a little bit about how this aligns then to corpora. Certain corpora we may find it more easy to identify this, like the likes of a tertium comparationis. In the likes of translation corpora, parallel corpora, for example, this kind of point of comparison is pretty evident, because the idea is that the texts, the translations, are versions of the original source text, right? So they're inherently comparable in some way there. And then I think when we decide what we want to look at within those texts, we have to then further think about comparability. So with that idea, we can kind of map this notion of the tertium comparationis against the kind of core idea in corpus linguistics surrounding representativeness, where at each stratum of the data, for each variable that we might consider, we need to align to make sure that what we're comparing is similar. Because one of the challenges, as we'll see with contrastive linguistic research, is that if we compare very different things, we will get very different answers, and then we will be able to kind of come to some conclusion potentially that things are different. However, it's not particularly meaningful if our comparison isn't well established. So we need to remove variables in order to be able to extract meaningful differences. Typically, when we look at contrastive linguistic literature, we see definitions of contrastive linguistics that address the comparability of languages as typically involving language pairs. So we compare one language with another. However, we see increasing calls for comparisons that involve multiple languages, and in terms of what these may be able to show us as well about the language, each other language, by points, creating more points of reference and affording us a little bit more nuance. So within these kind of key notions that we address, what we see are a lot of challenges, really, at the outset of a contrastive study. The first challenge that we might think of is to do with the quality of languages that we're comparing. Can we compare English with other languages effectively? And Swales wrote about this in 2004, where he talks about the notion that English is practically incomparable to any other language, given its global positioning, given its the makeup of its speakers and users, given the range of domains in which it is used, and that no other language really shares this level of positioning. So if we compare across these contexts, are we comparing similar communicative acts? Are we comparing similar kind of interlocutors, etc.? We also see different ways of categorizing languages used in comparative multilingual research. So if we're dealing with written texts, for example, we might see notions like reader and writer responsible languages. And within this, we could talk a little bit about, this idea of popping languages into categories. So is this a reader responsible language, or is it a writer responsible language? And as researchers, these are very attractive little categorizations, because we can create little groups. These languages are like this, these languages are like this. But in real terms, what we see is that it's a lot messier than that. And potentially it's a way of relegating languages based on certain kinds of norms. So for example, when we look at, again, I'll talk about this in one of the case studies in a moment, when we look at literature on French and Spanish, we often see those languages being positioned as being reader responsible. And in that way, the idea is that it's the reader's responsibility to navigate a text and understand it, while English is often positioned as being writer responsible, which would then mean that it's the writer's responsibility to make sure that readers have a good time navigating texts. However, when we start to add more languages to a spectrum, what we start to see is that it's not quite as simple as a binary opposite, but most often it's more of a spectrum, and that we may fit along a spectrum of reader-writer responsibility that is a bit more flexible based on domain and context, genre, etc. Similar ideas related to that, but that are maybe a bit more macro, relate to notions like content and formal-oriented cultures. So are these cultural spaces in which the ways of developing and framing knowledge is largely focused on the process or the product? Are they related to ideas of linearity or non-linearity, etc.? One of the challenges with all of this type of work, however, is the way in which we evaluate languages. So we may talk about something being nonlinear, linear, reader-friendly, not reader-friendly, but what we need to critique are the reasons for which we come to this conclusion. What are the criteria we're using to assess this type of text, or the type of text that we're analyzing? And what does that mean when we culturally situate it? Often what we find is that Anglo-centric norms about language are being used to evaluate languages other than English, and then kind of critiquing them through the lens of what we might expect in the English language in particular varieties and spaces of usage, which is problematic. And in fact, Spack in 1997 wrote about this. So this is a long-standing issue that really hasn't gone away, in which we see critical language being used to evaluate languages, often comparative. So this is better, worse, more effective, less effective, etc., in a way that often relegates languages other than English to being less effective at performing different kinds of functions. So the more languages we add, often this will help add a little bit more nuance and help us see interrelations between languages, differences between languages. And then, of course, we have to culturally situate that and reflect on the kind of the norms that we're using to evaluate, or the frameworks that we're using to evaluate these practices. There's also a directional issue in contrastive research. So when we think about how we might compare things, what we're often looking for similarities and differences. But actually, taking one step back, we have to think about what we're comparing. And typically we can categorize this into two groups, something like a divergent analysis or a convergent analysis, where a divergent analysis will be the idea that, let's go back to that notion of questions. We're looking for questions in texts. And what I want to really understand is what is performing the same function as questions that's happening in English in other languages. So I do an analysis of questions in English, and I do some kind of exploratory analysis of language used to perform that same function in other languages. It may be questions, it may be not. It could be something else. Whereas a convergent analysis, we'll take questions in each language, bring it all together and compare. And so both of these are valid, but what they do is give you very different perspectives on the same data and on the same texts. And so we need to make sure that when we are comparing things, that we interpret those comparisons in a way that's faithful to the kind of direction of comparison that we've undertaken. And then I think the last point there is the final one here, but quite a big one, is what do we do when we compare? We have these notions of sameness or identity, so two things that correspond directly to one another across languages. And I think that once we start to bring things like context into discussion, we start to see that this notion of sameness or identity is quite inaccessible and maybe non-existent, really. And there are quite helpful ways then of reframing this type of work that looks at notions of manifest and maximum similarity, where a manifest similarity are all the possible ways something could be similar, and a maximum similarity is the ways in which certain kinds of kind of features of texts that are similar correspond, and how they come together in order to be able to kind of give us a maximally similar correspondence. And so what that takes away from is the idea that that we need to find something that maps like for like. What this will often mean is that there is no direct translation that is very helpful at being able to demonstrate what it is we're looking at. Rather, it needs to be contextually kind of reframed in order to demonstrate what this would look like in different languages or texts. So this gives us, I guess, a bit of a framing against which to say, maybe we shouldn't bother. Maybe we should just not do any of this. It sounds very hard. But really what this gives us is a couple of pitfalls that we need to look out for. What are the kind of things that might undermine the quality of our research? What are the kind of things that would make it difficult for us to be able to dig into the kind of comparison that we're wishing to undertake, and of course, importantly, things to reflect on before we do that, right? So things to say, have we considered all of these factors before we carry out a comparative analysis in corpus linguistics? So what does this look like in practice? So in my first case study, I'll talk to you about some research I did looking at reader engagement devices in English, French, and Spanish, focusing specifically on questions across these languages in economics research articles. So I used the key app Corpus, which is the corpus of academic prose in English, French, and Norwegian. I took the economics subcorpora for the English and French, and then I made a Spanish subcorpus that was comparable to those corpora. And I extracted all of the questions that I could identify in those research articles that were part of the authorial voice. And when I did that, what I wanted to do was understand a little bit about how these questions were being used. So I established that questions were a tertium comparationis. They were a comparable common ground. They were used as markers of engagement across languages, and they could be used to perform a myriad functions. So they could be used to create emotion, get attention, frame the discourse, organizing the text, create niche, express attitude, set up claims, ask real questions. There's research to show that that texts that use questions in their titles are often more visible, they get more citations, they're often more read, so it can make interesting titles. And often in the case of this particular work, we're looking at how people are looking for direct questions signaled by an interlocutory force indicating device of a question mark. So something that's relatively easily searchable in a corpus. So we might think, great, we can dive in and we can start to look for questions using question marks. But there's also quite interesting research on this notion of indirect questions or concealed questions. And when I read about this, I started to think a little bit about the implications this would have for multilingual and contrastive research. What if what we are seeing in other languages could be presented largely in indirect ways in order to be able to pose questions? And what if these kind of critiques of other languages as being less reader-oriented were based on the idea that everything happens in direct questions, for example, and that we're not necessarily considering other ways of being able to frame questions to engage readers in such a direct fashion. So I wanted to dig a little bit into the likes of kind of the concealed questions as well as those that were shown by a question mark. And this was motivated by the kind of sense that when I worked across these texts, I had an initial sense that they were comparable, but as I looked into their context, I wasn't so sure. In the context of these research articles in economics in English, French, and Spanish, what could we say? Well, we could say they have very different publishing cultures. The expectations about what one publishes and how one publishes in each language is very different. The audience for which you write is very different, moving to maybe a more of a national than a global audience. The purpose for which you write is very different. Again, thinking about the purpose of being able to disseminate this in the global stage versus maybe writing to within a cultural paradigm that is shared. We also have to think about how these languages don't exist in a vacuum. Academic discourse is a social phenomenon, socially constructed and shared. And so it kind of engages with these notions of language contact. We may see shifts, so areas of domain loss where less texts are being produced in certain languages, in particular disciplinary areas, as we move into the English language norms within academic publishing, which can then result in the likes of diglossias and potentially notions of epistemicide. And I was really interested in this because I thought we have these kind of academic cultures and traditions that shape and frame the way in which you build, conceive of, and share knowledge. And Swales again wrote a really nice, well, nice in that it was interesting, maybe not nice in the outcome, but an interesting story about research that was published initially in Portuguese, I believe. It was research to do with some physiological phenomenon in the 1950s, and then later again, the same finding discovered for the first time in German later on in the 1990s, and then more recently since then, or 1970s rather, and then more recently in the 1990s, published again in English for the first time, each time for the first time, and it became part of this global knowledge economy. So we have information popping up in different places in different languages that's not necessarily being shared globally, and we are at the risk of maybe missing out on things there. But it also impacts the comparability of these types of texts in terms of how people engage with them. Even notions like disciplinarity are complicated. Is economics the same in English as it is in French, as it is in Spanish? Does it subsume the same kinds of sub-disciplinary areas, for example? How is it conceived of? Who is included? And genre, similarly. The notion of a research article exists across all languages, which is great, but then actually, if we think about things like disciplinary genres and their communicative intent, we might wonder whether or not these things are actually entirely comparable. So how did I deal with all of that? I thought a little bit about the tertium comparationis and equivalence. I tried to align that to representativeness and sampling. And I used that to talk a little bit about engage with these notions of disciplinarity and the discourse community, and also the disciplinary genre of the research article. As I struggled through that, I found this work by Swales again on discourse community, where he kind of readdressed the notion of a discourse community, this time breaking it into two particular types of discourse community: a place and a focus discourse community. And when we think about the place discourse community, what that results is something very similar to the original 1990 discourse community. But the focus discourse community was quite helpful in that it was this notion, very similar in ways to community of practice, but still focusing on the discourse as opposed to the wider practices, about language practices that are shared by groups that maybe aren't interacting with each other, and they're not necessarily bound by space or time. And so if we take space as a proxy for language and moving geographically, we can see this as a way of tying these communities together as being part of a bigger picture. So within this, then, the idea was to dig into some of the kind of textual and contextual features of research articles. And for this work, then what I did was I interrogated this notion of questions being a tertium comparationis by thinking about their frequency, their function, their length, their type and form. So whether they were yes/no questions, content questions, or then direct questions or indirect questions, where they occurred in texts, their kind of tense aspect, verbal modality, or their question sentence types. Were they simple, compound, complex, and complex? And overall, what I found was that the overall distribution and frequency was relatively comparable across the languages. There was no significant differences between English and French or French and Spanish, but there may be a slightly significant difference between English and Spanish. But overall, this was a feature of each language. And as I started to dig into what was happening within these questions, I could see that they were similar. For example, Spanish and English were similar in length and are shorter than French, which again, I think is interesting. This notion of long sentences is typically associated with French and Spanish, making them less reader friendly. But in this case, actually, English and Spanish shared more characteristics in that regard, with regard to question length, that differed from French. They were all using mainly direct questions, but there were examples of indirect questions in both. English and Spanish use mainly content questions, while French uses mainly polar questions. We can see certain kinds of verbs being used to ask questions that are indirect, often using similar kinds of interrogative verbs. The questions largely occurring in the middle section in this initial analysis wasn't so interesting because the middle sections were typically longer. In general, we see a convergence towards little passivity, mostly present tense, and mostly simple and complex questions in the overall kind of corpus construction, and the overall question construction, rather, in the corpus. And so we can move towards trying to define some form of correspondence across these languages then, where we can try and use these maximally similar or manifest similarities to generate this kind of maximum similarity here. And this is maybe one definition that we can propose of how questions correspond across languages based on this. I think what overall this kind of research kind of direction showed was how we need to consider all of these different variables when conducting comparative research, because if we minimize the number of variables that we use, for example, if we said, if we only used one equivalence, something like direct or indirect, and we saw that all languages mainly use direct questions, then we could draw a conclusion that they use them in a very similar way. But the more detail that we add in the kind of equivalences we use to interrogate interrogate that comparison, the more nuanced a perspective we get, and the more varied we see things work across languages that don't necessarily support previous kind of perspectives about what makes for reader engagement across languages, for example. So, as I mentioned before, a contrastive study is never finished. Sometimes you just have to write something up. But in this case, for example, I then redid the same study, this time having established that the function of questions were similar across all languages. I then analyzed all of those question functions individually based on those other criteria of equivalence. And the idea here is that as we dig further and more deeply into different characteristics, we can get more perspective on how things are similar or different. And if we take a look at something like the framing the discourse, for example, we look at kind of how frequent kind of items compare across or across languages within this particular function. You see that English and French questions that frame the discourse are quite long and Spanish questions are quite short. So that was quite different to what I mentioned a moment ago about questions in general. So the functional variation changes the story. English uses mainly indirect questions and French and Spanish use mainly direct questions. But actually, French proportionally uses more indirect questions in general. So this particular function sees indirectness in English more common than in the other languages, which is interesting. We see indirect kind of polar questions in English. French uses mainly direct polar questions, so yes, no questions. And Spanish uses mainly direct content questions. So even then within French and Spanish, we see a different focus. Are you answering a question with a yes or no, or are you answering it with content and information? Which again gives us a different kind of perspective on what kind of information is valued for these questions that are used to raise research questions and do other work like that in a text. We see that they occur in the introduction and middle sections in English and in the introduction sections in French and Spanish. So we get a disciplinary perspective there. The introductions contain these types of questions in French and Spanish, even though most questions occur in the middle. And then as we move across these other particular kinds of items, we see there's evidence of passivity and little passivity in this particular function. The present tense is most common, and we see a slight variation in the kind of text or the kind of sentence structures that we see in question forms. And when we try to compare that then further again against the general trends within the corpus and within the questions identified, we can see further variations still. And I won't go through this in great detail, but the point here being that our perspective matters when we look particularly at notions of frequency. So how are things when we're counting things in corpus linguistics here? What do we see? We see what I showed you a moment ago. But when we consider proportional distribution when compared to the general trend for questions in the whole corpus, we get a quite different story. And that tells us what is kind of special or salient about this little group of questions when compared to other ones. And the point here being that we can get very different stories depending on the way that we go into the data and that the comparison is directional. And so we need to understand exactly how and what we're comparing. So what does this mean for us? From a corpus linguistic perspective, we tend to look at ways that we can extract and count information, but we're often constrained by form. So we may want to think about ways that we can look around that in order to be able to find function that's happening in text that isn't limited by form. For example, pulling out indirect questions. We could think a little bit about the English language frameworks that we use to analyze texts across languages and how we maybe need to stand back, reinterrogate and kind of recontextualize them for the languages that we're studying. Because if we don't do that, we risk applying Anglocentric norms to languages other than English, and therefore drawing conclusions based on kind of faulty paradigms. With that notion, when I say what does it mean to engage a reader, that's exactly what I mean. That's a cultural phenomenon. Whether somebody feels engaged is culturally signposted and signaled, and how that happens in different languages should not necessarily be determined by one maybe more dominant language globally. The point I mentioned earlier about direction of analysis, divergent or convergent, is also important here. Did this study tell you that about engagement in general? Absolutely not. It compared questions convergently. It tells you how questions behave in different texts, but maybe in other languages like French and Spanish or beyond, they're not using questions to do all of that. They're using something else to do all of that. And so that would involve a divergent analysis where we look for other ways that people are expressing a particular function potentially. And so we need to kind of balance these particular ideas off one another and just be clear about what it is that we can account for when we're in fact comparing. So I'll move on to my second case study, which is quite a move away from academic discourse and academic texts in looking at translation and an area maybe closer to stylistics, looking at The Clockwork Orange in English, French, and Spanish. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the book, The Clockwork Orange. It's a short novella by Anthony Burgess. Basically, within this text, we were looking at, I worked with my colleagues, Bennett Vincent and Jim Clark at Coventry University, and we were looking at how Nadsat, the anti-language used by the youths in this text, was translated across languages, because it was quite an interesting form of anti-language that drew on Russian lexis and different kind of elements of kind of language, just like rhyming slang, archaisms, compound words, etc. And so if you're unfamiliar, the general idea behind Nadsat is that it makes for a bit of a difficult reading experience. The premise is that as one moves through the book, I don't want to give any spoilers here, but the book's been around for a minute, so hopefully you'll be familiar with it well enough. But as you move through the text, you're meant to become in some way indoctrinated into the usage of this language, which reflects a core theme in the book, which is the idea of kind of a certain form of therapy used in order to be able to convert people's ways of thinking about things. So as we look in the text, we see lots of strange language being used. So deng, for example, which means money, and you can see in this little word cloud, for example, lots of different elements of Nadsat that maybe don't necessarily make a lot of sense to you unless you're familiar with Russian, which is a lot of the core is related to Russian. So within this text, it's quite challenging to be able to navigate this. And initially, when this text was produced, you would never have glossaries or anything like that. Burgess didn't use glossaries because he wanted it to be something that happened as we moved through the text, not necessarily something that you could look up and kind of solve your problem for yourself. So within this, what we wanted to see how people deal with this across languages. What did they translate? So for example, in English, there's the word horror show, which comes from the Russian word хорошо, which is like good or well, but it takes on also this notion of horror. So it's something good, but it's not a particularly nice thing. So it's quite a complicated little word that also has a linguistic kind of link to Russian. And how would people deal with that kind of creativity when translating across languages, and what would be the best choices for French and Spanish? But I guess it would rely on elements of creativity, but also practicality, access to information, knowledge of the original, etc. So what could we say about the text that we compared? We looked at these particular ones because both have been around for nearly 50 years, the French and the Spanish, but they have quite contrasting reputation. And people have been quite critical of the Spanish translation in particular. And so we wanted to see whether or not Nadsat could play any role in helping us understand why things maybe are working differently for readers of these texts, why people see the French to be effective and the Spanish less so. Interestingly, also, I should say that there are two translators of the Spanish translation. The initial translation was based on the first 20 chapters, and a final translation of the last chapter was added by, I think, Annabelle Leal, maybe I don't have the slide here, in something like 25 years later. So there was quite a gap between the translations, and this is because one original copy of the book by Burgess didn't include the final chapter. So, so there are different versions of the book with 20 or 21 chapters. So we were interested to see would there be differences, and could corpus linguistics reveal differences in the translation activities that were taking place for these two texts. So the glossaries are flawed. If you ever look at a glossary, it includes language that isn't necessarily NADSAT. It includes language that, because there are other kinds of anti-language that are present, or other kinds of dialectal features that are present in the text as well. So we can't really trust the glossaries. And so what we decided to do is we decided to use keywords. Keywords are a pretty nice way of being able to identify words that don't really exist. So they exist only in this, and the keywords kind of brought them all to the top because they don't really should come up in any other text. We manually filtered them out, and we kind of categorized the results into different kinds of functional categories using kind of parallel corpus analysis. And so you can see a little bit there. Sorry, this is the slide that I mentioned. Annabelle translated the first 20 slides, and then it was Ana Quijada Vargas who translated the last slide. So among other things that we did with this, and you can read about it in the text, I'll share the citation at the end, we wanted to compare these last two chapters, or the last chapter with the rest of the book, and see what would happen. And so when we looked at the case of the two translators, what did we find? If we look here at the top 10 NADSAT words in the final chapter, we notice something interesting in the Spanish example, which is that the word хорошо, which is used in the first 20 chapters, just doesn't appear. This is a very common word, хорошо, which is an evaluative word used to mean something's great, but also encoded within that is that it's terrible, because the people who think it's great are often doing terrible things. So we're very curious about how хорошо was being translated, or horror show was being translated by Quijada Vargas in the last chapter. So what did we find? We found some interesting things. We found, for example, that it was being used to translate it as something bad, gruesome, or frightening. This idea of espantosas in the bottom here, which is not at all really the meaning that we get across in the English version or the French version. The French does quite a nice job with this idea of terrible, because it takes in that notion of tsar coming from a Russian word, and then terrible meaning terrible, but then also using it to mean good. So the idea of хорошо. So it's quite a nice creative way of solving that problem. Whereas what we see is translation loss in the case of the Spanish. We also see another, within the same chapter, it being used to refer to films, so something like this in the text. And we also see it being used to refer to something as being first class, or de primera. So again, complete translation loss here when we look at the notion of хорошо. So again, I guess demonstrating that the translation wasn't necessarily keeping this idea together. This was important because not only did it disrupt the use of this particular language, which by the end of the text you're supposed to be kind of fluent in terms of being able to understand, we also found examples of completely different ways of translating NADSAT that had been used throughout the book in other ways. So we see that this last chapter kind of disrupts the overall flow. What I think this particular text, or this kind of particular study rather, helps us see how parallel corpus linguistic analysis can be used for the study of this type of embedded discourse within translated texts, and as a way to also be able to evaluate the quality of the translations. And by drawing on something like a parallel corpus in this case, as opposed to a comparable corpus, the point of comparison was very easy to identify. And so what came then was looking in the wider context to see how effectively that was done, which I think gives us a bit of insight into some of the affordances of contrastive studies for looking at translation and stylistics. So I'll move on to my final little case study here, which brings together some other ideas related to contrastive and corpus linguistics. And I'll talk a little bit about a study that I conducted with Pascual on the use of stance nouns in COVID-19 parascientific communication in English and Spanish. So for this study, we decided to build a corpus based on I'm not sure if you're familiar with the website, The Conversation. The Conversation is a website that produces like academic blog type articles of about 700 words each, typically, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. So within this, we have academics who produce articles based on their own research. Academics need to be hired by academic institutions at the time of writing this and submitting this. So there are certain kind of embedded comparisons that are very helpful in the selection of this particular database, because it goes to the one institution, which is The Conversation. It goes through a similar editorial process. There are similar genre conventions as we move across languages, and a similar readership as we move across languages. So the idea is that it's not made for disciplinary peers, but largely made for maybe academics in other disciplines or non-academic audiences. So this was, we thought, quite a nice way of being able to establish a tertium comparationis from the outset, because the source of the texts is the same, but it's not a translation. And it led us to be able to develop this comparable corpus of COVID-19 discourses in the first 6 months following COVID-19. And so this is our comparable corpus, which we think is a pretty nice example of a comparable corpus, and that all of the frequencies of these different variables in the text align quite nicely, which is quite pleasant as a way to be able to put all of this together. But again, that comes back to the quality of the consistency of the website for being able to produce text in this way. It made it quite straightforward for us. So what did we do with this study? So for this one, we decided to do a convergent contrastive analysis looking at comparable forms, the stans noun plus stat, or the stans noun plus decay. So in this case, you might be thinking, goodness, by putting in this kind of constraint, we're going to miss out on a lot of things. And you would be absolutely right in thinking that. That is one of the challenges in doing kind of contrastive research, is that often we have to look at something really small, and we have to look at something that eliminates as many variables as possible, because that way, at least when we do the comparison, we can say with certain degrees of certainty that what we found is meaningful. If we put lots more stuff in there to draw comparisons across languages, we would probably find lots more differences, but it would be increasingly difficult to be able to attest that those differences are in any way meaningful, because it may just be other variables that are a factor in that. So the point here was that we delimited our focus to these particular structures, and we searched for all examples of that in decay in the Convites corpus. We looked for those that had a noun to the left of the node, and we analyzed them to be able to remove occurrences of non-SNTQ structures, so ones that weren't functioning as stance nouns, and then we generated our list of concordance lines that contained these particular types of text, or these particular types of nouns. And then what did we do? We decided to, as one of the areas of equivalence testing, we decided to semantically group these into different categories. So categories like argumentation, cause and effect, evaluation, evidence, expression of future meaning, factualness, idea, newsworthy or news related nouns, and possibility. So how did we come up with these particular kind of areas of focus? Well, you can see in some of the citations here, and if you want to get more detail on the generation of this particular framework, you can look in the paper. I'll share the citation towards the end. We based it on existing work, and also by looking at what was happening in the texts themselves. So we drew on Maggie Charles's work, we drew on John Flowerdew's work in this particular area, and we also looked beyond Anglocentric perspectives. So we looked, for example, at Samoniego's work, so talking about nouns that were being used to express future meaning, for example, and try to give an account that would allow for other ways of being able to use stance nouns that weren't necessarily banned by English language norms. And so when we did this, we then were able to categorize them based on their semantic meaning, but we also then looked at things like disciplinary area. So how these were being used in the soft sciences, in the hard sciences, or in interdisciplinary studies. It was quite difficult. Pascal will remember, like the spreadsheets, trying to make sense of these particular disciplinary areas. Because what we saw is that disciplinary variation in terms of the identification classification of disciplines varied quite a lot across languages, whereas we see an increased atomization of disciplinary labels in English when compared to Spanish, for example. And so we opted for a broader, arguably more crude categorization of hard, soft, and kind of mixed interdisciplinary. And the reason for this is that, and if you work with the texts in the conversation, you'll see that a more defined categorization is quite challenging, because we tend to see a lot of individual areas potentially that are identified, and how these maybe compare across languages and align across languages is quite challenging. We also looked at these texts with regard to ideas of drawing on heteroglossic research in heteroglossic context, of thinking about whether or not these stance nouns were being used to expand in the sense that whether they were open to other possibilities of interpretation, or were they contracting, were they limiting the other perspectives that could be understood, and also thinking about things like sources. So were they using evidence to support the arguments that they were making with these stances, or were they not? And so you can see this set of equivalences is very different to my set of equivalences I had in my question one, and that's because these are things we decided to test. We see these nouns being used, and we want to know, do they vary in these ways? And we could add more, and we could add more, and in theory you could keep going. So I guess it really depends on what it is you want to find out about your text. So what did we find? We found that broadly these SNTQ structures correspond in the data in terms of frequency and dispersion. So again, that establishes our tertium comparationis. It establishes our degree of comparability. So at this point, the comparisons that we draw can start to become a bit more meaningful. And what we see as well is that these particular structures were particularly useful in the framing of the COVID-19 pandemic in each language. So in Spanish, for example, we see the use of possibility and factualness nouns when self-sourcing their stances with expanding strategies. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that we see them using stance nouns that engage with notions of possibility, or talking about claims as being facts, while using themselves as evidence, not drawing on external sources, but using themselves, but also remaining open to other interpretations. While in English, we don't necessarily see the ideas or the notions of facts being used. Rather, we see it being more argumentational. So arguments, ideas are presented, but often in conjunction with external sources. So there's an authorial positioning there that's saying, I'm coming up with this idea, I'm making this argument, and bringing this evidence to support it. And I'm also closing down other perspectives. So this is not necessarily, there's not necessarily other ways we can interpret this. This is what it is. And so for, the first 6 months following a global pandemic, for two countries that were very close to one another, in which we see, maybe from an academic perspective, a lot of work that crosses geographical boundaries, we see the kind of social construction of this particular knowledge related to this issue vary quite noticeably in the way in which stances by authors are framed. And one of the arguments that we contend in this paper is that this may be owing to actually, before I say that, I should say that often actually this is counterintuitive to what we might expect, because often what we see is the reverse in Spanish academic texts. We may not necessarily see as much sourcing. We may see the argumentation elements being quite strong, and in English texts we may not necessarily see these being as explicit, and we might see more of a reliance on the notions of factualness, but also hedging quite a lot, for example, with possibility in English texts. So initially it struck us as being a bit confusing, like, well, how did this happen? This is not what we expected. But also we noticed that this is quite unique, because what we were looking at here was science as process as opposed to science as product. And this comparative analysis helped us see how different cultural spaces in which knowledge about this global issue was being constructed were framing that understanding in quite different ways in kind of a public space. So if you want to read more about that paper, you can find it there. As a little aside to this, in some recent work that I'm doing at the moment on climate discourses, kind of following a similar approach, I've not noticed the same pattern. So the idea within climate discourses, for example, is that there's more of a focus on factualness in general, arguably because a lot of the knowledge we have around climate discourses is a lot more solid and well received and well understood, as opposed to COVID-19, especially for the time frame that this corpus captures, which was in the first 6 months following its identification as COVID-19. So, so overall, what did I see with this kind of comparison? That sorry, I said here the research on the climate when compared to COVID-19, we see quite a few differences. But we also see, I think, similarities. One of the things I wanted to say is that we often are looking for difference in corpus linguistics, right? We're trying to compare two things and see what's different. But actually, similarity is often very useful, especially if we're looking at socially situated texts. And contrastive analysis will often reveal what's very similar about texts too. And I guess we need to sometimes make sure that we don't seek out the small few differences that we find in lieu of maybe an overarching argument that sometimes is based on similarity. And that similarity can also set in relief the important differences that take place within it. So something for us to think about, this kind of how global issues are kind of globally and locally situated, and how contrastive analysis can help us access that. So to kind of move towards the close of the presentation, I think working across languages can be quite challenging. And we have, I guess, core ideas within corpus linguistics that can help us address that when we think about notions of representativeness and sampling. However, I think drawing in theoretical concepts from fields that work in parallel to corpus linguistics, like contrastive linguistics, can not only help us do contrastive work, but I think the idea of engaging with interrogations of comparability could benefit all areas of corpus linguistic analysis that involve comparison, and make us kind of question how comparable the items that we're looking at are. One example I always give, because I think it's a really nice example, is an example offered by Kresarovsky in his book in 1990 on contrastive linguistics, is that when we are comparing things, like for example, he gives comparing squares and rectangles, he says that if we decided to compare them solely on the basis of their angles, we would come to the conclusion that these two things are exactly the same. They both contain 4 right angles and are therefore absolutely the same thing. But when we add in more layers of comparison and more critical perspectives on what we can compare, that becomes less the case, and we can start to see, okay, maybe there are slight differences here, and these issues help us address that. Contrastive linguistics kind of fell from favor in the 80s and has had a bit of a rebirth in the 90s and the noughties following developments in corpus linguistics, absolutely, but also a kind of adoption of certain notions drawing from pragmatics, drawing from the notion of kind of langue as parole, so the idea of contextually situated language. And I think within that, when we're talking about language, we need to think about culture and language and what these two things represent. So, for example, when I think about the Spanish translation of The Clockwork Orange, we might think about the time frame at which that particular translation was written, 50 years ago, over 50 years ago, in fact, and that perhaps the climate politically within the country at that time would have made it difficult for certain ways of expressing critique in language to be done explicitly, and the authors sought other means to be able to do that. So we need to think about cultural context, historical context, etc., as we look at language, which is something that contrastive linguistics requires and can help us with our corpus approaches. And within this, I think thinking about epistemological and ontological positioning. So what kind of epistemological frames are we looking at when we think about the knowledge and the information that's being produced in the texts that we're studying? And also, what is our own ontological positioning in the way that we approach the analysis of those particular types of texts? And how can we engage with this in order to be able to ensure that what we're doing from corpus linguistic perspectives is taking into account of the variables that are happening beyond the corpus in that way? So I think what I'm arguing for here is that we can hope for a closer theorization between kind of corpus linguistics and translation studies and contrastive linguistics, and thinking about the kinds of data that we make available and how we can build more comparable corpora that'll allow us insight into this. And that comparable corpora in a broad sense could even conceive of languages in within one language and looking across varieties, for example. But what we do need to think about is what we compare, and increasingly aiming for more than two languages to be compared, so that we can start to see things not as binary opposites, but as things that fit along kind of a linguistic continuum. So yes. So thank you very much. I hope that you found that helpful or thought-provoking or something in relation to use of corpus linguistics and contrastive linguistics, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Niall. Thank you so much. And so much to think about and so many insights. Well, okay, there's been lots of action throughout the chat, and we have a few questions here. So we have some time for Q&A now. Okay, so yeah, let me have a look at some of the initial questions that we could find in the both in the chat and in the Q&A tool here. Okay, so I suppose there are some very specific questions around the some of the resources that can be found, which probably I suggest that you guys, maybe you could contact Niall for, and those are really specific questions. So probably Niall can in due time probably get back to you with some insights there. So I'm trying to look at questions that could be appealing to most of the participants here. So thank you again for everyone asking questions here and throwing questions and debates here. So there's some questions about the use of corpora for stylistics and the use of stylistic analysis here. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one, Niall, like whether from your own experience, what sort of affordances have you found in your own work and research that can favor stylistic analysis of language, but also not only affordances, but I suppose limitations or challenges? I know this is a very broad question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess stylistics wouldn't necessarily be like an area that I've done a lot of work in. I guess in the work that I did on kind of translation and of Clockwork Orange, it kind of teeters into that space a little bit. But I guess in a broad sense, thinking about contextual features of language and how important that is in stylistic research, I think that one thing that contrastive linguistics maybe could afford from a theoretical or conceptual perspective is this notion on deeply understanding the context of production and usage, because I think within that we can get a sense of like the genre features that are maybe evident with the particular text that we're comparing or analyzing, and then being able to exploit those genre features in order to be able to think about what's happening in the text. So for example, when I think about the work on questions, thinking about the notion that research articles will often raise research questions at the beginning, I was kind of primed to think about the research questions being raised early in the texts, but didn't necessarily anticipate finding so many indirect questions being used to perform that function initially. In English, for example, I kind of assumed it would largely be happening directly. So I guess I was able to exploit the genre convention of the text in order to know where to look, but then using other kinds of methods to be able to find what I'm looking for. I think one of the challenges is that corpus linguistics is inherently form driven. And often what we're looking for when we're looking kind of from in the domain of stylistics is thinking about what people are doing with language and what's happening with it. So it would be great if we could search for a performance of some kind of function or some kind of intent, but it's not necessarily very straightforward. so one thing we could think about is looking outside, and in this case, for example, I looked in pragmatics, and I looked at this notion of illocutionary force indicating devices, and I thought, okay, how could I bring that into what I'm doing in this area of academic communication to help me understand, exploit the genre in a certain way, and find what I want to find.
Okay, brilliant. Also, some comments here on unexpected results, especially when talking about your case study number 1, and there was some sort of unexpected results in terms of how, for example, Spanish and English actually behaved in similar ways. But also, when looking at case study number 3, we could find probably more diverging sort of behavior going on there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one. This is a huge question, I know, as well. But probably that's the beauty of using data and corpora.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess my main thought about that is I expect the unexpected. I think that is kind of what I try to do with any of this work that's comparative, is to try and recognize my assumptions. So what things am I going to assume to see, and then try and challenge those assumptions. Because once we start down a track of looking for things that we think we're going to find, what we will indeed find them. So we think something's going to be constituted by a certain form. We search for that form. It does constitute that item. Our finding is that this form does this, and that's not quite what the reality often is. Yes, this form might be doing this, but lots of other things could be doing this too. So I try to anticipate maybe what my assumptions would be, and then I critique those assumptions in a way in order to stay open. I think with contrastive research, openness is the most important thing. So zooming out and accepting that there are lots of different ways things could be done, and trying to open up and find as many of them as possible. And so, for example, with the indirect questions, approximately around high 30s, low 40% of questions in each language were indirect questions. So had I just gone for direct questions, my study would have been very different. I would have had very different findings, conclusions that maybe would have reflected perspectives that are long-standing about reader engagement, etc., in different languages. But when I brought in this other dimension, it changed what I saw. And so that's because I kind of questioned whether or not that would be enough to tell me what I wanted to know.
Yeah. Okay, so linking back to case study number 1, we have a question from Pilar Moore. So, hi, Pilar. So she said, can you, Niall, tell us more about the size of she's talking
good
about
question. Yeah.
Yeah, size of the corpus from the first case study, the research articles in economics, and the sources from which the texts in Spanish were also taken. And she goes on to talk about the relevance of questions across different parts of the research article. So maybe
it's a very good question. I can see both questions there, and yeah, I think so. With that, what in terms of corpus size, I'm in this time of big data and scraping all of the things and making massive corpora. That's not necessarily where I sit. I think that one of the things in contrastive linguistics is that we want to eliminate variables that could hinder a comparison that we make. Bigger the corpus, the more variables inherently there will be within it. So with these corpora, they're relatively small. They were maybe around 400,000 words each in each language. And what that allows for is for this kind of detailed analysis, the deeply contextualized analysis of the text. So for example, in the identification of indirect questions, sometimes that actually required that I read the entire text, because whether something constituted an indirect question was functionally constituted by whether or not a question was answered later on in the text, which could be raised in the introduction and answered in the conclusion. And so sometimes you would have to get involved in the text in order to be able to determine things. So small corpora, I think, in the domain of contrastive linguistics are still really important, because what we're looking for really is to remove the variables that could make our findings, that could hide our findings really within them. So in that case, I looked at one disciplinary area. So in the original KIAP, they've got 3 disciplinary areas, but I looked at one because I wanted to see what was happening within one discipline. If I added more disciplines, I wouldn't have known if it was disciplinary area variation or a language variation, etc. And so it would have become a little bit more challenging. And then with the Spanish, what I did was I developed a corpus following the same sampling frame developed by Flotta et al. In their 2006 book that presents the KIAP corpus. So you can find out all the details about that in there. I think if I've read it and looked at it so many times, I think it's page 16 of the book, so you can find it there. It's a page range, in fact, so there's a few pages around it. And in there they talk about the process, and the process involves making a short list of journals, getting experts in areas of in academic spaces, for example, to determine the quality of those journals, so like raters of those journals, and then making sure that they're peer reviewed, making sure that they're open access, etc. So there were a bunch of different criteria that I used in order to make sure that what I had in Spanish was comparable to what was happening in English and French. And in the case of the number of questions being used, yes, I mean, that might be a bit of a surprise. What we could be potentially seeing there, and I wrote about that a little bit in the book, is that we may be seeing, as one might expect, a certain kind of Anglicization of the genre. The research article genre is like a genre that originated in the English language in this kind of format. Lots of other genres predated that served different purposes and did different things, but this particular kind of scientific presentation in this way kind of takes this a lot of English language norms with it, and so it could be more of a hybridization of cultural approaches to science communication that are embedded with maybe Spanish or French language norms, but that are also adopting English language norms in some way through language contact, for example. So yes, so I think it's particularly related to the genre itself, being related to the English language largely.
Okay, so yeah, there's a couple of questions here on corpus size and how representative a corpus can be, but I think that in your answer we can find also the answer to this question, and I suppose this is one of those questions that keep coming back because they're so interesting, I suppose, for everyone trying to use corpora in their research. Also, many of the questions here have to do with the sort of range of tools that you use, and I suppose the kind of analytic process that you follow. I really liked one of the questions here is I suppose is what tools do you use to compare the corpora? So it kind of, it's, how do you do this?
Yeah.
Keep short, please.
Yeah, no worries. So I think I'm quite tool agnostic in that I use whatever tool will help me do what I want to do. For the first study, for example, I used AntConc, and that was because actually, initially in starting that study, the idea was to use a tool that was freely available and that could be replicated by others who wanted to use it, for example, teachers, if they were interested. And then as I did it, I was like, oh my goodness, there's no way a teacher is replicating this. It's taking way too long. But it started out from that idea of openness and replicability and accessibility. And in the case of comparable corpora, what you don't necessarily compare within the corpus, you conduct individual analyses and you compare what you've done. So actually a lot of it was happening in Excel. It was happening outside of any kind of corpus analysis software. For the kind of parallel corpus analysis, I used Sketch Engine. Sketch Engine, you can upload your own parallel corpora, and it's very straightforward to be able to do that. So that's quite a nice tool for that. And then for our study on COVID-19 discourses, we also used Sketch Engine for that comparison. So a range of different tools used.
Okay, great. I also can read some very specific questions that I suppose can be found. The answer to those questions could be found in some of the references that I have provided. I have a couple of questions from Natalie. Phileson. I will pick up number 2. Do you have any recommendations for reading up on specific methodological processes, like, for example, how to define what is comparable, what is not comparable, and so on, for someone carrying out a CL, corpus linguistics-based contrastive study for the first time? So, yeah, give us your top 3 reading list now.
So and I can share if you get in touch with me, I can share the actual references, but the ones that I found, I mean, I found them a bit complicated. It's a little like mind twisty, but the ones that I found most helpful for this was Chesterman. Chesterman, he developed this notion of the contrastive functional analysis, so kind of broadening out to kind of contextual approaches to being able to analyze and compare languages. And also his work adopts a lot of translation, studies in translation as well as contrastive linguistics. So it's broad, and I found it very helpful for thinking. Historically, James's work in the 1980s, I found very helpful for thinking about where things came from, so that you could see a bit of what was the journey that people went through as linguistics was changing, and then how has these other fields like pragmatics and corpus linguistics kind of gotten involved and maybe reinvigorated the field. And then in between, it's a nice source from Kresarovsky in 1990 that talks about this as well, that I think is really interesting and I found very helpful for addressing notions of sameness and identity and comparability. Of course, then I think within the corpus linguistic domain, the Louvain School, there's lots of work that's happened in the Louvain School that deal with this. So kind of from Sylviane Granger's work and so on, Mariaude's work as well. Yeah.
Great. Yachi Wo has a very interesting question for you, Niall. Yachi says here, how can we researchers ensure that the methods we use for discourse analysis do not unintentionally introduce biases? And she adds here, to be more specific, do you have examples where you have started a new project to compare two corpora, but where you had to abandon or change the project because you have uncovered an issue that undermines the validity of the comparison? I think that's a very interesting question.
That's a good question. So I think that if that's your starting point of thinking, it's a great starting point of thinking, because I think if you walk into the project thinking that you might be embedding it with some degrees of bias, then you're going to try and be self-critical in that way, which is helpful. Research in kind of contrastive linguistics often talks about this notion of translator competence, so the quality of your language for being able to do translation, but from like a culturally situated perspective. I thought a lot about during the work on economics, for example. You know, I'm like a first language English speaker. I speak French and Spanish, but I also don't study economics. So I'm kind of removed from this community and I'm analyzing their language. And do I have enough contextual and disciplinary understanding to be able to interpret that information? And often that requires quite a lot of wide reading. And in some ways, one of the things I quite love about this type of work is that you end up reading lots of things that aren't linguistics. You kind of broaden your mind in different kinds of ways. But it can be quite slow because you have to be careful that you're not necessarily that you're not making assumptions based on your own kind of ontological position. And so often when I'm doing this type of work, I think about my own positionality and I think about my assumptions and I try to challenge them. A notion that in Tony McHenry's book on fundamentals in corpus linguistics, and it's one of the things I talk about also in a paper that was out earlier this year in IJCL, on kind of question illocutionary force indicating devices, is this notion of falsifiability, which I found quite helpful in contrastive studies. So you're not trying to prove a point, you're trying to prove yourself wrong. Keep trying to prove yourself wrong. And if you can't prove yourself wrong, then you may have reached something that's meaningful. So if you arrive at a conclusion that you think, oh, that's very nice, maybe that's a nice conclusion I could share, that's not the point to stop. That's the point to say, okay, why could this be wrong? What could I have done wrong to get at this point? What have I not considered? And you come at it again from a different perspective. And if you can't falsify it, if you can arrive at this idea that you can't disprove for yourself based on that practice, then it may be that you've arrived at something that you think is worth sharing. But you kind of feel the need to do that because you're working with languages sometimes that you don't necessarily have that like position in the same way as maybe a first language speaker. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but we have to be careful.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Final two questions. I mean, there's so many questions. Thanks everyone that are throwing your questions here. I'm sorry that Niall won't be able to deal with all of them. But I think that, again, if you have very specific questions where Niall can help you, I know that Niall will be super happy to get back to you. This is an interesting question, to be honest, from Eman. One of the complications of multilingual corpora is the fact that researcher needs to speak all the languages that they are comparing. So what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I often get asked that question when I present at conferences. Why not this language and why not that language? And I'm like, well, I wish. Give me some time. But I think that actually it opens up a different world. You'd have seen that maybe at the beginning I talked about some particular frameworks of ways of thinking about multilingual corpora, for example. And perhaps I can go back in my slides to kind of show you. I think I've lost it now. In this kind of work here. And this is from a handbook chapter I worked on with Dong Fang. And this was actually within this, we have a case study on Chinese. And in this work is actually something where I was able to learn a little bit from their work too, and working in the Chinese language. And this kind of collaborative approach to being able to do this type of analysis, I think is very helpful, because what it does is it gives us insight into different languages without necessarily being able to speak them. So perhaps our approach isn't to try and learn all of these languages, but it's to find people with whom we can collaborate to be able to address these things and bring people together to solve this problem. It also will help us address issues. Often this work is quite intensive, in that you are dealing with deeply contextualized language, and you need to do very detailed analysis of texts, often looking across a large span of an individual text, which makes it difficult to be able to do inter-racer work, for example, because it's difficult to find somebody who's willing to put all of that into even a small selection of what you've done if you're working individually. So I think collaborative work is a way forward for that, where we might be able to work together and work across languages and bring our own individual experience and expertise.
Okay. A final question here is on some sort of ethical / copyright issues with looking and using texts and corpora. And this is a tricky one, I know.
What's the question there?
Yeah, I suppose it's I think it was early on in the chat, and the specific question was about the Clockwork Orange, I think, whether those particular texts could pose copyright issues, but also I'm also thinking about
you're right. I mean, it's not something that I spoke about here, but you're absolutely right. So I think in the case of these particular translations, one of my collaborators on the project, Jim Clark, actually works with the Burgess Foundation, and so he was able to kind of get permission to be able to do this type of work. In the context of the research article corpus, for example, I contacted editors of the journals, and I found out whether or not copyright licenses lay with the individual authors or whether they lay with the journal. And in the context where they lay with the journal, which thankfully in my position, all the journals I use, the copyright lay with the journal, I was able to get permission from the journals to use the texts to do that. For the likes of the conversation, they're open access, part of the Creative Commons license, so they're actually usable without necessarily having to go get permission from the conversation to be able to access them. So they're out there in the world to be used. So yeah, these are things that you have to think about, but and consider, and there are often different pathways. So in some cases, it may be quite challenging to get permission from individuals, not because they won't give it, just because they might not necessarily see it. People are busy, etc. So in the case of the journals, it was helpful that there was directly related. They owned the copyright and were able to give that kind of permission. But absolutely something we always have to consider.
Yeah, and also something that you don't often get the chance to read about. So I think we need probably more insights and more research in that particular area. Yeah. I was thinking the first book I bought from written by Anthony Burgess was the history of the English literature. When I bought the book, I didn't know that Anthony Burgess was the author behind Clockwork Orange. I'm talking about many years ago. But then it was kind of a funny coincidence that my first history of English literature that I bought was actually
that's quite funny.
it's kind of cool, I suppose. Okay, so thanks everyone that popped down today. 140 people still here, so I think this is a wonderful audience today. We've had around 250 to listen to Niall's fantastic talk today. So thank you, Niall, so much.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for coming along. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. So thank you, everyone. If you are in the West, it's time, maybe almost time for dinner or time for dinner. If you are somewhere else, and I know many people here are somewhere else, maybe it's time to go to bed. So thank you so much, everyone. See you next week. Okay, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you again. Thank you so much.